Shine my shoes right now. The billionaire's voice sliced through the elegant ballroom like a whip, and suddenly, every conversation stopped. Champagne glasses froze midair, forks hung in silence, and the entire hall turned to see who had dared to speak so loudly. Standing at the very center of the room, under the glow of a crystal chandelier, was Charles Kingston, a man whose name alone could make investors tremble. He was a billionaire CEO, infamous for his arrogance, dressed in a $20,000 suit, his diamond cufflinks gleaming under the light as if to remind everyone who the king of this room was. In front of him stood a janitor in a faded blue uniform, gripping a mop handle so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His name was David Miller. His boots were worn, his shirt had bleach stains, and his face showed the exhaustion of someone who had worked all day just to keep this glamorous venue spotless for the people inside. And yet, when Charles pointed at him with that mocking smirk and said, "Come on, boy, you work here, right? Get on your knees and shine my shoes," something shifted in the air. A few guests laughed nervously, some whispered, while others deliberately turned away, not wanting to get involved. Nobody ever stood up to Charles Kingston. Nobody ever said no to the man who could make or break their careers with a single phone call. But what they didn't know was that tonight, of all nights, Charles had chosen the wrong person to humiliate. Because David Miller was no ordinary janitor. And in just a few minutes, Charles's world would be turned completely upside down. Earlier that evening, before the gala had even begun, David had been quietly sweeping the marble floors, making sure every corner gleamed. He had been working at this hotel for almost a year, never complaining, never calling in sick, and always finishing his shifts with quiet dignity. Most guests never even noticed him, except when something spilled, and he'd silently show up to clean it. But tonight, his heart was pounding harder than usual. His hands trembled slightly every time he wrung out the mop. It wasn't the work that made him nervous. No, tonight was special. Tonight, David had come here with a purpose far greater than cleaning. Because what no one, not his coworkers, not the guests, not even the hotel manager, knew was that David Miller wasn't just a janitor. He was heir to a vast fortune, a fortune he had inherited 3 months ago when his father, a reclusive philanthropist and private investor, passed away. His father had been one of the quiet backers of Kingston Enterprises. Yes, the very empire Charles Kingston now ruled, and had left David control over the family's investment trust, which secretly owned a majority stake in one of the largest firms keeping Kingston Enterprises afloat. But David hadn't said a word to anyone. He could have quit his job the moment he received that inheritance. He could have bought a mansion, a fleet of cars, lived a life of pure luxury. But David had been taught something different by his father. Before you spend a dime, before you claim a title, learn how the world really sees you. Learn how people treat you when they think you have nothing to offer them. Then, and only then, decide who deserves to stay in your life. So David stayed. He kept cleaning floors, taking out trash, fixing broken chairs, all the while observing the world around him. And tonight was the perfect test. Tonight was Kingston Enterprises' annual gala, and Charles Kingston himself was coming. David had heard stories about Charles, his temper, his arrogance, the way he looked down on anyone who earned less than him. But David didn't expect things to explode the way they did. The double doors swung open with a dramatic thud. Charles Kingston strode in like he owned not just the room, but the entire building. His entourage, 3 men in equally expensive suits, followed close behind, laughing at something Charles had just said. The crowd turned to greet him, some clapping, some trying to make eye contact, hoping for even a moment of his attention. Charles loved it. He thrived on this power. He scanned the room, gave a self-satisfied smile, and then his eyes landed on David, who was quietly mopping the far end of the ballroom. Well, Charles said loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. This place looks decent for once. Did you people finally hire someone who knows how to mop? His friends chuckled. A few guests tittered. David didn't flinch. He just kept mopping, refusing to give Charles the satisfaction of a reaction. That, apparently, only annoyed Charles more. "Hey you," he barked. "Janitor, come here." The room went silent again. David put his mop aside, straightened his back, and calmly walked over. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice steady. Charles looked him up and down with an expression of fake pity. "Your shoes," Charles said, pointing, "look worse than my bathroom rug. Do something useful, clean mine." There were a few shocked gasps, and then a hush fell over the room as everyone waited to see what would happen. David's calm face didn't change. "Sir," he said evenly, "that's not my job. I maintain the floors." Charles tilted his head back and laughed, as if David had just told a joke. "Oh, too proud to shine a billionaire's shoes? Maybe you'd rather find a new job." His voice dripped with mockery. David said nothing. The silence was deafening. Charles, emboldened by the lack of response, sat down in a chair, leaned back, and stretched out his expensive Italian leather shoes. "On your knees. Right now," he ordered. That was it, the final straw. David didn't move. He didn't kneel. Instead, he stood taller, looking Charles dead in the eye. And then he said the word no one had ever dared to say to Charles Kingston. No, the entire ballroom gasped audibly this time. Some guests nearly dropped their glasses. Charles's face went red with fury. "Security," he shouted. "Get this man out of here." Two massive security guards began walking toward David, and for a split second, everyone thought they were about to witness the janitor's public humiliation. But just as the guards reached for David's arms, a voice boomed from the far end of the room. "Mr. Miller? You're here." It was Mr. Thompson, the hotel's general manager, rushing in. His face was a mixture of surprise and nervousness. Everyone froze again. Charles, confused and irritated, gestured toward David. "Who cares who he is? He's a janitor who refuses to do his job." But Thompson shook his head frantically. "No, Mr. Kingston," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't understand. This is David Miller, the majority shareholder of Kingston Enterprises' biggest investor group." You could have heard a pin drop. Charles blinked. What?" he stammered. David reached calmly into his pocket and pulled out a leather folder. Inside were official documents, bearing seals and signatures. "My family's trust owns 52% of the firm that funds your company," David said, his voice calm but carrying across the room. "Which means I am technically your biggest backer." A murmur rippled through the crowd like a wave. Charles's face drained of color. His entourage suddenly looked very small standing behind him. David took a step closer. "Tonight," he said, "I wanted to see who in this room would treat me with dignity, even when they thought I had nothing. Thank you for making it very clear where you stand." The room was so silent you could hear the clinking of ice in someone's glass across the hall. Then David turned to Mr. Thompson. "I'll need a seat at the head table," he said simply. "After all, we have a few decisions to discuss." Thompson nodded so fast it was almost a bow and personally escorted David to the most prestigious chair in the room, the one right next to where Charles usually sat. But tonight, Charles wasn't allowed to sit there. Instead, he stood frozen, humiliated, as whispers spread around the room. Guests avoided eye contact with him, afraid of being associated with his downfall. David looked at him one last time and said, "You can sit by the kitchen. Maybe next time you'll remember that respect isn't about money." By the end of the night, as the gala ended and the guests filed out in stunned silence, Charles's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the investment firm. The message was short and brutal, effective immediately. "All non-essential funding to Kingston Enterprises has been frozen pending an internal leadership review." The $200 million expansion deal Charles had been bragging about all night? Gone, overnight. His board of directors would be calling a meeting the next morning. Charles sat in his car outside the hotel for a long time, his hands shaking, realizing he had just destroyed his own reputation, all because of his pride. As for David, he quietly returned to his janitor's closet, put away his mop, and smiled to himself. He wasn't going to quit. He wasn't going to flaunt his wealth. He would keep working, keep staying grounded, just as his father had taught him. Because at the end of the day, David knew something Charles didn't. True power isn't measured by the size of your bank account, but by the way you treat the people you think you don't need. And tonight, an entire room of powerful people had learned that lesson the hard way. So, tell me, what would you have done if you were David? Would you forgive Charles and give him a second chance? Or would you take away his company for good? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you think twice about judging others, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful, life-changing stories like this one, because you never know who's really holding the power until the moment they decide to show it.